Hi everybody. I received an email this morning from one of my viewers asking me about vestigial organs. He said that he watched my video that I have on vestigial organs that I posted before, and for those of you who've watched my videos, you'll know that I've posted several videos along these lines. But this particular viewer said that he was kind of disturbed because he found a web page on the internet that was showing tons and tons and tons of examples of so-called vestigial organs and things along those lines. And he wanted to know what I thought about it. He wanted to know if I could give some answers to some of their objections. So originally I was going to email him back, but I thought that instead I would make a video responding to some of the things on the page that he sent me. And I thought it would be cool because I thought, hey, here, everybody can listen in. Everybody can benefit from this, and I think it would be, in this one case, I thought that it would be easier for me to actually make a video rather than typing out a lengthy response. And I just think that the way human beings are wired, I think that something like a video would be more interactive. I thought it would help people to remember what's said and understand and be able to process what's said a little bit better than if I were to just write it all out in a long technical email. So I guess here goes nothing. So I'm going to go here and take a look at the website that he sent me. Alright, so the website is evolutionevidence.org, and it says /evidence/remnants. I'll put a link in the description box so that people can go to the page themselves and see what it says for themselves. I'm actually going to be referring to it and encouraging my viewers to go to this page and taking this time to exercise discernment. See if you can see the problems in their logic. See if you can see the problems in their thinking. One of the things that I noticed on this page was a lot of the things on this page I've really talked about before. They talked about basically blind cavefish, supposed hip bones in whales, things like this, things that I've made videos before on, and they talked about the appendix. Alright, here we go. They have one thing right here on the appendix that says, the writer for this portion of evolutionevidence.org spent 8 days in the hospital and almost died after his gangrene appendix ruptured. The appendix serves some function in humans and other species by acting as a bacteria reservoir. I think he should have said bacterial. I think that would have been better grammar. But you know, anybody can make a mistake like that. I'm not one of these people that says, "Oh, I'm better than you because you have a spelling error." I think that's wrong. Obviously, I spell slug with 2 G's, so, you know, just for the humor of it. And also because greenslug.com with 1 G was already taken. And the author goes on to say, that said, its original purpose was to break down cellulose. So let me read that one more time. The writer for this portion of Evolution Evidence spent 8 days in the hospital, almost died after his gangrene appendix ruptured. The appendix serves some function in humans and other species by acting as a bacteria reservoir. That said, its original purpose was to break down cellulose. There's several things that are being said here. The person who put together this page really isn't putting together this page in a logical fashion. He's just kind of throwing up random things and saying, well, this is evidence for evolution. The problem is that evidence doesn't speak for itself. That's kind of a fallacy it's made. Evidence always has to be interpreted. So if you were investigating a murder mystery, say you're on CSI, and you're looking at all the different clues, you have to have intelligent people put those clues together. The clues don't just open their mouths and start talking. DNA fingerprinting, for example, you might have it where you do some DNA fingerprinting and it might say, oh, well, this DNA fingerprint matches up with Joe. It matches up with Joe's DNA fingerprint. Unfortunately, that's one of the things people don't understand about DNA fingerprinting, for example, is you might have to do a more detailed DNA fingerprint, and it might turn out, oh, it turns out Joe was not the killer, it was actually Bob, Joe's brother. So a lot of times that's probably a little too much for, I hope that wasn't too much for most people. Maybe I'll do a video on DNA fingerprinting in the future, but sometimes you have to go into more detail. Sometimes you have to open up and look at more of the evidence. You might have it where, well, this person has brown hair and blue eyes, and we know the killer had brown hair and blue eyes, so that's evidence that they killed the person. Yeah, not really. That might mean that it might be possible that person killed the person, but there's lots of people in the world with brown hair and blue eyes. So you'd have to have a lot more solid evidence than that. And I think that, anyway, with the appendix, what's being talked about here is the person is acknowledging that it has a function. And since it does have a function, you can't really call it a vestigial organ. I pointed out in other videos before that evolutionists will sometimes define vestigial organ as an organ that has no function, and since it has no function, they say, well, that's evidence for evolution. And on the other hand, they'll define a vestigial organ as, oh, well, it can be an organ that has lost some of its function or shrunken in size over time. Now, if you're using the second definition that, oh, well, it's lost some of its function or it's shrunken over time, you can't really call that evidence for evolution, because you're saying, well, over the course of evolutionary history, it's lost some of its function or it's shrunk. You're already assuming that you know what the evolutionary history looks like. So you can't turn around and use that as evidence for evolution, because that would be circular reasoning. To say, oh, well, it evolved like this, therefore evolution is true. And also, that would be kind of, by that definition, just about anything would be quote-unquote vestigial. Even the human brain, for example, was larger in the past. It has recently been proven, to all reasonable doubt, and creationists and evolutionists agree, that Neanderthals did contribute to the modern human gene pool. So some of our ancestors were Neanderthals. And Neanderthals actually had a larger brain than we do. So if you're saying, well, an organ that has shrunken over time is vestigial, then you'd have to say the human brain is vestigial. And the definition of what's vestigial and what's not almost becomes meaningless, because just about anything has potentially shrunken over time. But saying that something's useless and therefore evidence for evolution, as I've pointed out in my other videos, even within the creation model, if you have God creating a perfect Adam and Eve, for example, over time their DNA is breaking down. We live in a fallen, cursed world that's unraveling. So people are getting worse and worse over time. It is very possible for Adam and Eve, for example, to have fully functional organs that have since that time lost their function. That's possible. Now, interestingly, every single organ in the human body is known to have a function. The appendix, the tonsils, all of these things that were supposedly vestigial organs once upon a time are known to have a function. People talk about wisdom teeth. Wisdom teeth are known to have wisdom teeth are actually, people say, oh, well, there's not enough room in your jaw for wisdom teeth because we had larger jaws in the past. You know what? I'm sure we did have larger jaws in the past. The Australian Aborigines, before they introduced a modern, more refined diet, they didn't have any problem with their wisdom teeth because they were doing more chewing, and it helped their jaws to develop more properly. Now, back to this thing with the appendix is, there's really no argument here. This person is saying, oh, well, the appendix is kind of a leftover from evolution. But there's a lot of circular, well, how do you know it was left over from evolution? I mean, he doesn't really explain how he knows that. It's like, were you there? Did you do some kind of experiment where you have overwhelming evidence that this is some archaic remnant of evolution and not really something that was part of human beings as they originally designed? He doesn't really go into that. And a lot of this is, I mean, just look at this. He is acknowledging the appendix has a function. So you can't say, well, it's vestigial in the normal use of the word, saying, oh, vestigial means useless, a useless leftover from evolutionary past, because it's known to have a function. It's known to be part of our immune system. Also, let's take a look at this second claim. That said, its original purpose was to break down cellulose. Now, let's say, just for the sake of argument, we know the appendix has a function, but for the sake of argument, let's say that somehow we knew that the appendix once upon a time broke down cellulose, that it was designed for a more vegetarian diet. Would that disprove the creation model? Not at all, because, I mean, if you look at the Bible, and you look at what creation says, Adam and Eve were originally vegetarian. God probably designed them with forethought for knowing when the fall would happen so they'd be able to digest meat, but in their original environment, they were designed to be vegetarian. Doesn't mean God couldn't design them so they'd be able to live in a different environment as well, such as the one we live in today. You know, a good engineer will design something to be able to operate in multiple environments. That perfect environment, unfortunately, only lasted for so long. Now, let's say that over time they lost the function. Let's say the appendix had a different function from what it has today. Say, maybe in the past it not only stored bacteria, but it also helped to break down cellulose. Is that consistent with the creation model? And I'd have to say yes. I once watched a talk from Jerry Coyne where he talked about genes in human beings that, according to him, are homologous to genes in rodents that are used to help them smell better, for lack of proper scientific terminology. So these genes were used to help the animal develop proper smell receptors, proper olfactory sensory. Oh, I'm doing good today with talking. Let's just say that he's right. Let's say that human beings do have these leftover genes that were designed originally to be able to smell. And of course, he wouldn't say they were designed, he would say they were evolved. Let's say that human beings once upon a time in our ancestry had a better sense of smell. We had a superior sense of smell to what we have today. We'll say that we were able to smell like bloodhounds. Why not? Let's just say that's true. Just take it at the face value for once. Would this contradict the creation model? And the answer is no. Perhaps man was originally created with a stronger sense of smell, and over time human beings have lost it. I mean, this would be kind of similar to the way that fish have lost their eyes in caves. I don't want to sound Lamarckian or anything, but if you have an organ that's not really being used, if an organ is serving you no benefit at all, it's going to be eliminated by natural selection eventually. And the reason is because the body is spending so much energy to create an organ, in the case of fish it's like an eye, that no longer serves, it's not serving it any function, so it's more prone to infection. You're spending all this energy to build it. Natural selection is going to favor the fish with no eyes in a cave that's in total darkness. In the case of human beings, the ability to smell properly might not have been that important for our ancestors. So after people left Eden, you have the Ark, you have Babylon, you have people spreading all over the world from Babylon. The ability to smell properly isn't really that important. So if you lose the ability to smell properly, maybe natural selection won't necessarily favor that, but you might end up having genetic drift where, you know, the guy who can smell really good doesn't really have that much of an advantage over the guy who can't smell. So anyway, I want to look at some of the other things on this this website here. Oh, I loved this one. This guy talked about, on this website, they're talking about the so-called blind spot in human beings. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, your eye apparently has a tiny little blind spot because of how it's wired. Now, evolutionists have said, well, this is totally bad design. The eye is stupidly designed. It should have been wired in some different way. Now, of course, I look at that and say, well, let's see you build a better eye then. No, seriously, if you think that the eye is stupidly designed, let's see you go into a laboratory and build a better eye, pluck out your eye, or have your friend do it. Have your friend pluck out your eye and put in the new one, and then you have a more superior eye. Then you would have a superior eye compared to what we have now. You'll make billions. I mean, if you think the eye is stupidly designed, let's see you go do that. And the reason evolutionists don't do that is because they can't. I have read before that the eye, it would take a crazed supercomputer, whatever a crazed supercomputer is. I assume it's a very intense computer from a few years ago. Let's say you have a crazed supercomputer. It takes the crazed supercomputer 100 years, or it would take it 100 years to do what your eye does every second. Your eye is not just a lens the way evolutionists try to make it out to be. It actually does have processing power with all the different nerves and so on and so forth inside of your eye. This blind spot argument is kind of nonsense. Your eye is optimally designed. I have read scientists who have said, you know what, if you have these few evolutionists who are trying to push evolution, the evolutionary apologists, and they're trying to say, oh, well, the eye is stupidly designed because it has this tiny little blind spot. And they said, well, the eye should have been wired totally backwards compared to how it is today. I have read scientists who really know what they're talking about, who have said, you know what, if the eye were wired the way they want it to be wired, if you accidentally looked at a bright spot, you'd be blind for months. The way the eye is designed, which does give a tiny blind spot, is optimal. Now they have a little chart on here. They have a little experiment you can do to find your blind spot. They have two little plus symbols, one's right above the other, then they have like a circle off to the side, and you're supposed to close one eye and stare at one of the plus signs. And then after you stare at it for a few seconds, you have to stare directly at it at just the right distance, and you have to do this all really carefully, and then that circle will disappear. Now think about the logic of this. You have to close one eye just to be able to detect your blind spot. Also, you have to go through this very, very careful experiment and do everything just right, otherwise your blind spot can't even really be detected. And plus, the fact that we have a blind spot is basically irrelevant because you have two eyes. You don't walk around like this all day. Unless you've had an unfortunate circumstance where you've lost an eye or you're born without one. Which is unfortunate. This happens, but I mean, if human beings are functioning properly, if they're living the way that they were designed to live, you have two eyes. If you have a whole body, which including two eyes, if your body's whole and healthy, this blind spot really doesn't affect you. And besides, I've noticed that when I try to detect my blind spot with this really, you have to go through this kind of complicated experiment. Not complicated to perform, but I'm sure that this was difficult to set up. Somebody had to be very careful with how they set this up. You have to go through this kind of convoluted experiment just to be able to detect your blind spot. Even if you're closing one eye, if your eye is moving even just a little bit away from this one tiny spot, or if your head goes back and forth at all in any direction, you lose, that blind spot goes away. You end up detecting the thing that was supposed to disappear with a blind spot. So you have to be very careful just to detect it. And you know what? The fact that evolutionists are using this as evidence of poor design shows they're grasping at straws. This argument's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, come on. Honestly, if that's the best you can do, you don't have an argument. I'm going to just be very blunt about it. You don't have an argument if that's the best that you can come up with. Anyway, let me take a look at some of these other examples. Here we go. They talk about wings on flightless birds, and you know what? As you can imagine, creationists have two potential explanations for a flightless bird. Let's take a look at a penguin, for example. The penguin is a bird, yet it's unable to fly. Two possible explanations. Perhaps it had an ancestor that could fly, but when it was originally created, but over the time it has lost its wings. That's perfectly within reason within the creation model. And there's also a second possibility. Perhaps God created the penguin in basically how you see it today, where the wings aren't used in flight. Does that mean that the penguin is stupidly designed? No, of course not. Because in reality, the penguin actually can fly, but it flies underwater. I know some people are going to troll me and say, oh, that's swimming. Look it. The penguin is amazing in the water. They're swimming around like crazy, and they're living in a part of the world that pretty much the very, very, very few other animals have been able to colonize. I mean, you have seals and things like that in the water, but if you're going to Antarctica, I don't know of any other animal that lives on the ice itself. Maybe there are, but I mean, when you think of Antarctica, you think of penguins. So, talking about saying that flightless birds are, I mean, come on. This falls perfectly within the creationist model. I mean, it doesn't contradict it. Now, when we're talking about things like this, when you're talking about like blind cavefish, evolutionists will say, oh, well, here's an example of a species that has changed, and that proves evolution. Look, everybody agrees that species change. Creation scientists have acknowledged that species change right along. It was actually originally creationists that came up with the idea of natural selection. And even in Darwin's time, people talked about organisms changing. If you read Origin of Species, Darwin's creationist counterparts, his contemporaries, believed that species change. He acknowledged this, but they did have a different definition of what a species was. In their view back then, they defined the term species as being a single act of creation. Now, modern-day creationists will use the term kind. They'll use the term created kind or Berriman to say one group of created organisms that could interbreed. So you would have like the dog kind, the cat kind, the human kind, etc. And within each kind, you might have several species. For example, lions, tigers, house cats, etc. They are all part of one created kind. And creationists proposed that originally they could all interbreed. And one person commented on one of my YouTube videos recently about this. He said that, oh, well, look at, a lot of these different species of cats have different numbers of chromosomes. Yes, I know. Bobcats and house cats, to the best of my recollection, have different numbers of chromosomes, yet they can actually interbreed and they can produce fertile offspring. It's one of those interesting things about biology. But evolutionists are making a huge fallacy. Yes, that species change. Actually, they're making several fallacies. Fish go blind in caves. Lots of animals go blind in caves and they'll lose their pigmentation, all that good stuff. That doesn't prove that mutation and natural selection can be a creative force and create something that's fundamentally new. I've looked at a lot of mutations that are supposedly evidence for evolution. Nylonase, antibiotic resistance, etc. In all those times, I've never seen an example of a mutation or a series of mutations that has really created something fundamentally new. I've made videos on even the so-called long-term evolution experiment done by Lenski's lab. In 20 years, they looked at the evolution of E. coli. Actually, it was E. coli changing over time. Evolutionists love to play this game where they will define evolution one way and then use it in a completely different context. Now what it is it's a bait and switch fallacy. It's a bait and switch tactic. What they do is they will define evolution as just meaning change over time. They'll tell students, oh, hello Johnny, evolution means that species change over time. Now what does evolution mean? Oh, evolution means that species change over time. And then they'll use it with completely different definition. They'll end up using the term evolution to mean the idea that all life on Earth developed from one universal common ancestor that lived in the ocean billions of years ago, and that everything developed from that one common ancestor with no outside intelligence to guide the process. So they'll say, well, you can go from being a fish to being a philosopher via mutation and natural selection. They'll say, oh, well, because fish can lose their eyes in a cave, that proves that fish fish can also become a philosopher. Of course, these are two completely different definitions. Or sorry, these are two completely different definitions, two completely separate ideas. But evolutionists want to lump them together and make them the same idea. Yes, that species change over time. Yes, mutation and natural selection occur. That doesn't prove that mutation and natural selection can take a prokaryote and cause it to develop into all of the life that we see today. That's one of the major fallacies of evolution. That's one of the major fallacies of neo-Darwinism. Organisms change over time. Creationists have always agreed with that statement. However, the fact that a species of fish can go blind does not prove that a fish can turn into a philosopher. It does not prove that fish could gradually develop legs and walk onto land. And you know what? A fish losing its eyes is not a smaller version of a fish gradually growing legs and walking onto land. They're two very different things, two very different processes. It's not about the size of the change, it's the type. A fish going blind in a cave is a change going in the wrong direction if you're going to try to claim that natural processes can make a fish develop legs and walk on land. Now, according to evolutionists, you have onward and upward type changes. You also have the loss of features. You might have horizontal type changes. So you have downward, upward, and like sideways type changes. But we've never seen these onward and upward type changes. We've never seen an organism develop a brand new biochemical pathway. And you know what? This is what evolutionists are really missing. And I think that a lot of times they get it, but they don't want to acknowledge it. A fish going blind in a cave does not prove that a fish could become a philosopher. Here we have two interesting pictures. One of them is a picture of a alleged leg from a whale that washed up on shore. Now I've taken a look at these leg bones, and I compared them to modern day whale flippers. And it was interesting because even though to us these bones kind of superficially look like legs, when I compared them to the bones in the flippers, they actually matched up quite well. Now what that tells me is that these aren't legs, these are flippers. And you know what? If an evolutionist is going to say, well, the fact that whales have flippers is wonderful evidence for evolution, I mean, come on. I mean, what are you going to say? I mean, these bones are totally consistent with flippers. These are flippers. These aren't legs. So that's what I got to say about that one. Now, a lot of people have said, oh, well, some evolutionists will say from that, well, why is it that you have so much similarity in the design between the flipper of the whale and the leg of some kind of terrestrial animal? Well, look, I would say, why is it that you have so much similarity in the design between a bridge and the design of a skyscraper? If you have let's say you have a bridge. Let's just look at a bridge. You might have triangular supports. So you have these triangular shapes that are meant to hold up the bridge. You might also have triangular shapes in the skyscraper, potentially. And both of them might be made out of steel. So they're made out of the same material. They have similar design in the shape of the shapes that the materials are put together in. They might have a lot of similarities in their blueprints. Does that prove that they have that they developed through purely naturalistic processes built from millions and billions of years ago with no outside intelligence guiding the process? Does that prove that they have a common ancestor? No. In the case of the bridge and the skyscraper, it might very well be that they have a common designer, a common architect. We'll say they have an extreme, unusual amount of similarity between the bridge and the skyscraper. Potentially it's due to a common architect. Or it might be two guys who went to the same architect school, because if you look at everything collectively, you look at your iPod, you look at your computer, you look at the bridge, you look at the skyscraper, look at your cell phone, collectively, all these things have one common designer, which would be humankind. Now, some of you, just think about that for a minute. Humanity, collectively, designs quite a few things. And yes, there's lots of engineers within humanity. There's lots of many designers. But if you take a step back, this is consistent with a common designer. And in the case of the similarity between the bones in a whale's flipper and the bones in a land animal's leg, is this consistent with the creation model? I'd have to say yes. And the reason is you have similarity in the design. They're constructed with a similar pattern, and that can point us to a common designer. It also shows that certain similar engineering principles with the strength of the structure are brought into place. Some of you are possibly going to respond with this video saying, well, why didn't God take the whale flipper and give it some completely different design from what we see in land vertebrates? Just for the sake of argument, let's say that he did. Let's say that instead of whales having the similar structure to the forelimb of a modern day creature, let's pretend for a minute that they had some very different arrangement in their bones. How would evolutionists respond to that? They would say, oh, well, that proves that evolution. They would look at that. They wouldn't say, well, that disproves evolution. They would interpret that within the evolutionary worldview. This is the fallacy that they're going to interpret that within the evolutionary worldview. They're going to say, oh, well, this flipper has a very different structure compared to the forelimbs of most vertebrates because the whale had different needs in the ocean and it evolved into a very, very different structure. And you know, it's interesting because if you look at the breathing apparatus for a whale, if you look at the way their respiratory system is set up compared to ours, there's some major differences. You and I, as human beings, I assume everybody who's watching this is human, but I mean, if you're a Martian or whatever, I'm glad you're watching. You think about how we breathe. We have our mouth, we have our nose, and everything is hooked up through basically one tube. And things split off whether they're going to go to the stomach or whether they're going to go into the lungs. This is how you and I are designed. This is how you and I are built. Whales, however, have a very different design. Their blowhole on their head that connects to their lungs is not connected to their stomach in any way. So you have one tube that they breathe through and one tube that they eat through. And this is great because this helps them with their particular needs. They're wired very, very, very differently. Now, would you say this extreme difference in design is evidence against evolution? Now, those who are arguing for intelligent design or arguing for creation, any of these alternative models to evolution, they say this is really evidence against evolution because it would be very difficult for something like this to evolve. The types of changes that would be involved would not be possible within the few million year time span that whales supposedly evolved from land animals. Evolutionists, however, aren't going to bat an eye. When they look at that difference in design, they generally, what they do is they look at that and they say, well, see, that means that whales evolved a very different system from land animals. So if two things are very similar, they'll say, well, that's evidence for evolution. If two things are very different, they'll say, well, that's the result of evolution. So no matter what you find, they're wearing evolutionary glasses. They're wearing a mindset that is looking at the entire world in evolutionary terms. They're looking at it in terms of a worldview. So anything that fits within that worldview, they're going to view as evidence for evolution. Two things have a lot of similarities. Does that fit within the evolutionary worldview? Yes, it does. But they're making a logical fallacy of affirming the consequence, I think it's called. I've never actually had to talk about this particular fallacy. Now, what is affirming the consequence? Basically, in this context, what it would be is somebody might say, well, if evolution is true, then we would expect species to have a lot of similarities. And then they will go, oh, well, species have a lot of similarities, therefore evolution is true. So you're saying, well, you have possibility 1, and you look at the world, because they say, well, evolution is one possibility, and if evolution is true, then we would expect species to have a lot of similarities. Well, since species have a lot of similarities, that is strong evidence that evolution is true. But here's the fallacy of that. if creation is true, if we are all made by a common designer who's using similar engineering principles to build everything, if we're all made by one God, then you would expect things to have a lot of similarities. It's, all life on Earth pretty much uses the same language in their DNA. The same basic language, the same basic genetic code is used in the language of all life on Earth. That's very consistent with the idea that we're all made by one God. If you had human designers, like I've talked about, if you had one designer that made both the bridge and the skyscraper, he designed the bridge, he designed the skyscraper, an evolutionist might come along and say, well, see, since the bridge and the skyscraper have lots of similarities, that proves they had a universal common ancestor, and it proves that they developed from that universal common ancestor with no outside intelligence guiding the process. That's the fallacy. It might also be that that bridge and that skyscraper had a common designer. They also had common needs. And if we didn't have so much similarities between, I've talked about this more in my other videos, but if we didn't have a lot of similarities between living things, the biosphere would be impossible. If you had it where you had right-handed amino acids in one species and only left-handed amino acids in the other, then they wouldn't be able to eat the same food source. They wouldn't be able to use the same food source, and actually having both in the same environment, they'd be toxic to one another. So you have to have some similarities just to have things compatible. Also, God commanded us in Genesis to subdue the earth. A lot of people who are not Christians have read that and they think that means, oh, we're supposed to rape and pillage the planet. No, it doesn't. It means we're supposed to take care of the planet and we're supposed to understand it. We're supposed to go forth and do science. So, yes, species have similarities. That's totally consistent within the creation model. And it's what we would expect. Our loving Creator wanted us to be able to understand our bodies. He wanted us to be able to understand the creation. It's much easier to do that. If a mouse's body and a human being's body were pretty similar, that means that by studying the mouse's body, it can help us to understand the human's body. And unfortunately, we do live in a fallen world. We live in a world that does have death, disease, and suffering, which is not how God originally designed it. So in this fallen world, the fact that mice have a lot of similarities to human beings, that's an example of God's provision. That's an example of us being able to test drugs and pharmaceuticals on mice in order to study what happens in the mouse's body before we apply those same drugs to human beings. Obviously, we have to be careful doing that because a mouse is not a human being, but they have a lot of similarities to us, so that can really help us with medicine. That's why, so basically, two things having a lot of similarities can be the result of a common designer. It can also be the result of a common ancestor. It can be either one. It's not about, in this case, it's about interpreting the evidence. And honestly, in this case, the evidence fits a lot better with a common designer. Also, there's a lot of similarities out there that contradict what we would expect from evolution. There's similarities out there that are not thought to be the result of a common ancestor. But I've made an entire video on this, and I'm going to refer you to that rather than going into detail on it here. Now I want to look at just a couple more on here because I don't want this video to be too long. Oh, here they have pictures of below is a fetal fin whale showing the vestigial tooth buds within their jaws. Evolutionists have made quite a bit out of this. When baleen whales are developing, they have something they basically have non-baleen teeth that come into their mouths. And then these are later replaced by the more brushy, bristly type teeth. Evolutionists have said, well, see, that proves that they evolved from whales that had teeth once upon a time. Creationists have pointed out that these teeth are not vestigial. They're actually used in the jaw development. They're actually used in the development of the whale's jaw. So they help the jaw to develop in the proper shape. And then these bristly teeth come in later. This kind of reminds me of how evolutionary textbooks have traditionally claimed that human beings have gills in the womb. They refer during embryonic development, human beings have several arches around here. In fish, one of these pairs of arches goes on to develop into gills. These are called pharyngeal arches or pharyngeal pouches, depending on what you read. But a lot of times textbooks have referred to them as gill slits, which is extremely misleading. Even fish don't have gills at that stage. Interestingly, in humans, these are used to develop like the tonsils, the parathyroid gland, and the thymus. So these aren't useless leftovers from our evolutionary past the way that textbooks have kind of led students to believe. And they're not gills, they have nothing to do with gills. In fish, in a typical fish, you'd have several arches. One of them will develop into gills, and the others will develop into different organs, or used to be developed different parts of the body in this region. But they're not gills. At least in fish, they're not gills yet. In human beings, they're not gills at all. Talk Origins actually picked up on this. That's a common evolutionist website with a lot of nonsense on it. I'm going to be making a video about them in the future. But it was pointed out by a scientist who was not an evolutionist, saying, you know what, these aren't gills, they have nothing to do with gills. Talk Origins' response was that, well, nobody ever said that they were gills. They said that they were gill slits, which is something totally different entirely. And I'm like, yeah, of course. Gill slits doesn't imply gills at all. Who would ever think that they would? Anyway, but that's Talk Origins for you. Basically, calling these gill slits when you're trying to prove evolution is circular reasoning. It's just based on the assumption that human beings had a fish for an ancestor. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot on here that's pretty... There's a lot of basically non sequiturs on here. What I recommend is people go through this and they check it out. There's at least one more on here that I wanted to comment on. Here it is. The internet is full of pictures of people with atavistic tails. Here's just one. The vertebrate labeled in yellow are abnormal and were removed by surgery. They represent the revival of ancient tail genes. No, they don't. Their citation for this is Talk Origins, and I'm actually familiar with this particular Talk Origins page, and familiar with this particular Talk Origins example. One person actually sent this particular piece of information to Creation Ministries International, and they ended up responding to it by giving them quotes from mainstream scientists who are talking about this particular topic. I'm just going to read you a tiny part of the response article. Alright, so the person emailing said, part of what they said was this. There is an x-ray of a baby with a mutated tailbone that is apparently longer than a normal spine. And the response was, this is just part of the response, but it says, in fact, that x-ray shows a normal healthy spine, as admitted by the original research paper by Barmeor et al., from which that x-ray image, figure 3 in the paper, was taken. Doubtless other readers of that web page will have gained the same incorrect impression that you, and I at first, got. Namely, that there exist people whose coccyxes, or tailbones, are longer than normal and form the core of protruding and movable appendage, i.e. a functioning tail. This turned out not to be the case, and as a modern embryology textbook notes, rarely a caudal appendage is found at birth. Such structures are of varied origin. Some are teratomata. They practically never contain skeletal elements and are in no sense tails. But basically that's Talk Origins for you. They're just going to put some propaganda out there and try to fool everybody. I think this is interesting because you can attack the person who responded for being a creationist all you want. You can attack me for being a creationist all day. I get so much nonsense on my page where people are like, well, because you're a creationist, your arguments aren't valid. No. That's an ad hominem attack, and it's not valid. It's irrelevant. But what this person did was they responded by saying, hey, if you look at the original research paper, that basically this propaganda on Hawk Origins and that was repeated on this other website was taken from. This is not a tail. According to the original paper, this is a normal, healthy human being. There's no tail coming out of them. And by the way, these, according to the embryology textbook that he was citing, these aren't tails. So anyway, I think that's enough for this video. What I want people to take away from that is not necessarily the individual refutations, but a lot of it is how you, it's not about the evidence necessarily, sometimes it's how you look at the evidence. And you know what, the creation model fits the evidence a lot better than the evolution model. You might have lots of pieces of evidence that fit with evolution, but that doesn't mean that they're evidence for evolution, because these same pieces of evidence fit with the creation model just fine. And honestly, if you look at the evidence as a whole, if you look at all of the evidence fits with creation. Not all of it fits with evolution. The creation model fits the evidence a lot better, whereas evolution, you might have plenty of pieces of evidence. You have pieces of evidence that fit with it well, I'll readily admit that, but then there's lots of pieces of evidence they have to jump through hoops to try to make it fit. And you know what? As somebody who's studying science, I'd much rather go with the model where you don't have to jump through hoops. And that's why I'm a creationist. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you for your time. Subscribe, comment, rate. Let me know what you think, and share my video with your friends. This is Greg, out.